Hey everybody, CVH here. Today we'll be taking a look at the Reanimator Sorcerer deck that you can see on screen. This is another deck that I've been messing around with since the Fall of the Dark Brotherhood's release. A lot of cool new ideas have made their way into the ladder, and this is one of them. So this was a suggestion from Onia. He was in my stream chat, and he wanted me to play a deck based around cards like Falkreath Defiler and Blackroom Necromancer and Sorcerer. Now I've always loved Sorcerer, so of course I wanted to at least experiment with this, and I really just enjoyed the deck a lot. It had a pretty positive win rate. I will probably be posting a gameplay video of this deck soon. I haven't had a whole lot of time outside of the streams and the recording of these videos to really play a whole lot, so I'm just doing this deck tech for right now. But if you guys want, feel free to leave a comment if you definitely want to see some games with this deck, or any other deck you want to see games with, of course. But for this video, I'm just going to go over some of the basic concepts of the Reanimator Sorcerer. So the idea of this, first and foremost, is that it's very similar the way I built it to traditional mid-range Sorcerer decks, just a lot of good creatures in Sorcerer, so playing them on curve is sort of a foolproof strategy. It's hard to go wrong playing Windkeep Spellsword into Young Mammoth, etc. However, this deck has some pretty interesting combos, which can allow you to get even better curve plays going, such as the Falkreath Defiler with Slay, summon a creature from your discard pile. You do get to choose with this card. That's a question I get asked a lot. It is not random. I don't think it would be very good if it were random, because it would simply take too long to get a very mediocre effect at best. We definitely wouldn't really be building around it for sure. But yeah, you choose the creature from your discard pile. If the lane is open, if there's any open space in the lane of Falkreath Defiler, it will be summoned there. If not, it will be forced into the other lane. That's how I found out it worked, after misplaying and accidentally putting the Nahag Leave I got back in the wrong lane because I didn't realize I couldn't choose. But yeah, that's how it works for now. And also the Blackroom Necromancer, which is not a card that needs much introduction, but it's been played in a lot of mid-range Sorcerer decks, and since we will have some cards to dump some very high powerful creatures in our discard pile early, seems like a natural inclusion here, if not just a bit more inconsistent. Well, maybe not more inconsistent than the Defiler, but more inconsistent than it usually is, because this deck, I'll mention it, but it can have some interesting draws, to say the least, which means you won't always have an easy time of it staying ahead in life compared to your opponent. But yeah, let's start at the bottom and talk about some of the more basic stuff. We have the Firebolts, Shrieking Harpies, Wardcrafter, Windkeep Spellsword. Harpy, incredibly high utility. Wardcrafter, Windkeep Spellsword, just very, very good 2-drops, some of the best in the game. And Firebolt, some of the best removal in the game for, the early game. And these are really the backbone of how we stay alive and not super far behind on board early. As you can see, we don't currently have any cards like Ice Storm. You could tech Ice Storm if you feel it's right in the current meta. I didn't find the space for it, but that's one reason we want to stay ahead on the board very early, because we don't have any real ways to get it back. No super huge swing turns if we don't already control the board. If we do control the board, we have quite a few swing turns. Sorry, I probably just made a noise right there. Windows, man. Windows. Interrupting my deck techs. So the last 2-drop we have is Palace Conspirator. 2-drop, 2/2 from the new set, Fall of the Dark Brotherhood, with summon, draw a card, then discard a card. Now this card was very, very hyped when it first got previewed. I don't think it's made quite the splash a lot of people have anticipated, but for a deck like this, it's fairly perfect. So as we'll talk about later in the curve, we have some of the 9-drops we'll be dumping. They also can just sort of clog your hand. You still do lose games with this deck to just having a poor hand. Any deck can succumb to something like that, but if you're playing 6 9-drops and other high curve things in a deck that's primarily going to be aggressive, you can run into that problem more often. And a card like Conspirator really just sort of hedges against that while setting up for your crazy combos with the Defiler. So the idea there is that we have either Conspirator on turn 2 or directly after a Defiler, and we're drawing a card and dumping either Blood Magic Lord, Supreme Atromancer, or like anything else that's like moderately big. You can dump Blackworm Necromancer, Emmerich, Night Shadow Nagleave. They're all sort of the mid-range part of the targets we could get off the Defiler. But Blood Magic Lord and Atromancer is an inclusion in a lot of mid-range Sorcerer decks, not usually as a 3-of, but you can see it like that. But obviously the Blood Magic Lords are just additional late game. We're using them to get even more value out of primarily the Defiler, because we can target what we get back. And with the Blackroom Necromancer, obviously it is random, but filling up your discard pile with more high priority targets like the Blood Magic Lord can increase the potency of this card as well. Also worth noting with these 6 9-drops that while they are pretty awful in your early game hand, if you get to the late game organically, as a lot of decks, at least currently right now on the ladder, people are experimenting with a lot of slower decks. I've seen Control Monks, Control Warriors, you know, Slay Scouts, Ram Scouts, all that kind of stuff. If you get to the late game organically, there's nothing to say that you can't just play these cards directly from your hand too. It's not like they're only live if you get them off of the Falkreath. In fact, you'll probably wind up playing, you know, a card like Atromancer more from your hand than from your discard pile. Blood Magic Lord, you'll probably wind up discarding a bit more because it's a little bit worse from your hand if you're just trying to close the game out. But of course, if you get it early from a Falkreath or a Blackworm Necromancer, it probably just wins you the game. So that's the general idea of those combos, and that's how they work. Also worth noting, you can play like a, you know, a Conspirator or the Camel we'll talk about. Like after you play the Defiler, you don't have to have something huge in your discard pile when you play this card, unlike the Blackworm Necromancer. So you can like play it against a clear lane. Your opponent can say to themselves, well, their discard pile is empty. I'm not going to prioritize killing it or, you know, giving them no trade whatsoever. If they can't get anything back, I'll just make sure they have nothing in their discard next turn and deal with it next turn. And then you simply play Conspirator, dump your 9-drop or whatever you have and get it back. And it's somewhat of a surprise to a lot of people. So yeah, moving on to some more pretty obvious cards that we don't really need to talk about too much. Daggerfall Mage, Haunting Spirit, Young Mammoth, just really powerful 3-drops that are in virtually every kind of mid-range sorcerer you'll see. No reason not to play them here. We do want to take the board early. And if we really relied on cards like Defiler to get the job done, we'd probably lose a lot more games with this deck. The fact that we have such a powerful curve as a backbone to really, you know, build upon gives this deck a lot of game against, you know, the slower decks in the first place, so we don't really need to have a combo go off to win the game, period. So yeah, the Falkreath Defiler is our basically primary 4-drop. We really want to get the effect off of that. Lightning Bolt, I don't need to talk about this card much at all. It's just Lightning Bolt, so we're playing 3 of them. I should talk about the next 2 cards. I'm going to start with Merchant's Camel. It sort of functions the same way as Palace Conspirator. Like I said, this deck can have some very awkward draws, so 2 Merchant's Camel sort of allows us to bypass some of those. For example, if we're in the late game and we don't want to draw any more 2-drops, or if we're in the early game leading to the late game and we don't want to draw too many more 9-drops because we really need to find a play for the next turn or something like that. Obviously, the Camel doesn't trade with a whole lot, so it's not really a card you would see in a lot of mid-range decks, not very proactive on the board, but I thought it was a necessary evil given the rest of the deck's construction. Only playing 2 of them, though, because we're trying to sort of, you know, fight against the awkward draws, not really add more to the deck, so that's why there's only 2 of those. Speaking of a card that's occasionally very awkward, I'm including 2 copies of Little Girl. It started as something I just wanted to test, and it turned into something I wanted to keep in the deck. I'm not entirely sure. You could play a few things over it. You could play Restless Templar, you could tech the Ice Storm like I said, you could play Royal Sage, I guess, something like that. Another defensive card like Preserver of the Root might be fine. What I was looking for was a card I could play early, and if it stuck to the board, it would single-handedly almost win me the aggro Battle Mage matchup, or, you know, another really fast aggro deck, maybe aggro Archer or something like that if they don't have a silence. So in that regard, it's done its job. It has stuck a couple times against those decks, and when it does stick, you usually win the game, but I knew I was going to be even weaker to those straight-up aggressive decks than the mid-range Sorcerer decks I've played before, because we have a higher curve, we have much more awkward draws, and a lot of the cards are simply dead if we're behind on board. So Little Girl sort of gave me a way to swing that around on turn 3 or 4 if I could stick it, and it was pretty good. There are other things to consider here. I encourage you to give this card at least a bit of a shot. It definitely procs more than you think it will, more than you think it will actually change. So I do encourage you to give it a shot, but that's my reasoning behind it. I think whatever you put in the slot should be defensive, which is why I was kind of iffy on the Royal Sage. I would recommend maybe Preserver of the Root, Midnight Sweep, Ice Storms, something like that. But I wanted something that I could play slightly earlier than Ice Storm and swing the game around that way. Shadowfen Priest, don't really need to talk about it. Blackworm Necromancer, already talked about it. Hiking Emmerich, again, kind of a staple in Sorcerer, don't really need to talk about it too much. Night Shadow, another threat that we can dump with the Conspirator, then get back with the Defilers and the Blackworm Necromancers, so there's that also. While it is slow, it's another way to simply close the game, or close the door on the aggro decks that are trying to get those points of damage against you. So since I thought I was going to be weak in that matchup, this seemed like an obvious inclusion, especially since we have so much synergy with the mid-rangey and high-cost creatures in the deck. Nogleave, again, don't really need to talk about it too much in virtually every deck with Endurance that you'll see, and of course, if we can cheat it out early, all the better. Then the Blood Magic Lords and the Atromancers to round it out. There are definitely some other later game options to consider. All you have to do to build this deck is click the 7+ thing on the bottom. No, that's not necessarily the case. But, you know, you could experiment with other high-cost things as well. Bone Colossus, a very proactive threat. If there was no aggro and there was a lot of Merrick, I'd maybe consider taking out some of the heal for Bone Colossus. Night Talon Lord is fine. Gravesinger and Iron Atronach are interesting, along with Odiving. I felt like all of these were slightly too greedy because the odds that I actually play them to a good effect from my hand ever were just incredibly low. As it is, I've almost never played Blood Magic Lord from my hand in this deck, maybe just a couple times, so I didn't feel like I wanted to include a card that was almost assuredly going to be dead, just for a slightly more backbreaking Falkreath Defiler proc or something like that. Because honestly, if you can get a turn 4 or turn 5 Blood Magic Lord or Atromancer, I mean, it's not quite as good as maybe an Iron Atronach or a Gravesinger in certain situations, or an Odiving in certain situations, but on average, it's gonna be good enough. So that's basically it for the deck. It's a cool concept. I know Reanimator's a thing in Magic, even though I haven't really played that game too much, but hopefully you've enjoyed. I should be having some gameplay going up on the channel either tomorrow or soon after this video. Again, let me know what you think. Let me join the conversation in the comments if you think this deck is good, if you wanted to add something to it, if you think there's another way to do it, what other decks you'd like to see on the channel, what gameplay videos you'd like to see. Feel free to leave a like if you've enjoyed. Feel free to subscribe to the channel for future gameplay videos, strategy videos, all that good stuff. Follow the stream at the link in the description, and I will see you guys next time.